and Professor Badrul Alam, who will share their perspectives of what kind of an impact COVID-19 will have on India in the political and other spheres. I accord a very warm welcome to both our speakers. I also take this opportunity to welcome our principal, Professor Harpreet Kaur. And we have had a series of webinars at Mata Sundari College, and ma'am has always been our guiding light. She's always been there for us, encouraging us, supporting us with her gentle smile. I now request Professor Harpreet Kaur to welcome our esteemed speakers and share her views and observations on the topic of today's webinar. Professor Harpreet Kaur.
Good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure that the Political Science Department has, IQAC has planned this webinar. And we have two eminent speakers today, as Manisha has told, Professor Amita Singh and Professor Badrul Alam. And I really welcome both of them from the core of my heart, because I know their work in their own field has been commendable. And so it is really a pleasure that they have spared their valuable time and they have joined us at this stage. And of course, the topic today is the impact of COVID in India, a perspective. It is really very relevant because what I understand is that COVID has actually, really changed the way we think, and of course, the way we live. Now, what is happening is that because basically. What I feel is, we are confined in our homes, of course, and I feel that, life is so simple. And, there are no outward, whatever we used to do outwardly and all and, we are living very simple lives. Of course, we are lucky to live this kind of a simple life. But there are others who are not so lucky, and they have, their entire outlook has changed, their entire lifestyle has changed, and of course, their impact on the economy is tremendous. And of course, we have seen the host of migrant laborers and the plight which they are undergoing, and they could sustain this, lockdown for some time. But later on, of course, they had to shift and they have to move, and they were really desperate to move back to the villages. And now what is happening is, everything was centered around the cities. And although India is a reluctant urbanizer, we have been urbanizing so fast, and a host of laborers from various states had come and centered around the cities because of the employment opportunities. And suddenly, when the employment opportunities are just not there, just finished within a fraction of a second, then they are sort of forced to move back, and we all know that now. But what will they do there? Of course, for their livelihood, something has to be done. And so here I believe the role of government is very important, because government has to provide them opportunities at their own villages also. And the entire focus which was there on the cities has moved to the villages. And so the entire perspective has changed. The overall scenario, the developmental goals, the targets of the government have changed. Of course, they are doing under the employment guarantee scheme. Government is giving employment to the youth, and it is really sad to find out that there are certain some laborers who are so highly qualified. They have done MBA. They were working in good positions in the cities, but now they are forced to take up that that kind of a labor under the schemes, because after all, substances is most important. And so now I feel that entire focus should be shifted, and government has to do it. And secondly, what I believe is, herein the role of community becomes very important, because we know that the local problems can be solved only at the local level. It is not possible that that those kind of big problems are just forced upon by the government, and government has to involve community, whether it is the NGOs or the self-help groups and so on, to improve the plight. And of course, as I said, that villages are the focus now, and which always should have been, because Gandhiji focused on self-sufficient village, which we have just forgotten. And so the community has to really come forward, and of course the local problems can be solved at the local level. And hearing those qualities of community where you are altruism and those, generosity and all this also have really shared, and those kind of emotions out. At least those people who are capable, who can do it, the rich class must do something, because of course financially they should be supported. And Indian perspective, thirdly, what I find very strange scenario, because health workers are actually being are sort of angels who are working for the community and working for the people and working for those people who are actually so sick and all. But the treatment the doctors and health workers have found in India is very surprising. I mean, this kind of treatment is not there in any country. And so, and we have seen, although those outward coverings like the government is felicitating them with the aerial kind of felicitation is there and so on, but that is not sufficient. We have seen doctors being attacked by the members of the community, and so herein we need to grow up also. Herein the life, change in the citizens, that with that kind of a citizen improvement should be there, or a civic sense should prevail rather amongst the people, and our education should focus on it. And so focus of education also should bring that how people, and even those self-help groups and all should aim the civil community that this kind of really treatment is really very very sad and should not be there. Then, of course, on the economy, major impact on the economy, and we have seen, how economy has changed overnight, and I think the setback will take at least maybe 2 years to pass, and people have lost their employment suddenly, and and now that we are towards the opening up, the laborers are not there, and so how the factories will survive this. Factories will survive this. This is another this is another major problem. So and of course the impact on cinema and theater and all. Now the scenario has changed totally, and what is happening is that with this change of scenario, people, what is my voice breaking? Um, is my voice breaking?
Yes, ma'am, you're not very audible.
Okay, I think it is maximum. I don't know why it is breaking. Okay,
Ma'am,
I'll
now
be
it's
louder.
fine. Ma'am, it's fine now.
Okay, I'll be louder. So again, the entire, so again that Bollywood and all those, and the TV host of TV serials and everything, and again it will take time to survive all this onslaught, and so the policy making shift should be is the main major thing which the government should think also, and at the community also there should be a major shift in outlook, and that is most important. And lastly, what I feel is that digital, infrastructure should be improved more. And we are, like this webinar and other things, we are working through this. And earlier, the people who were so reluctant to adopt this have been adopting it, because this is the only means of communication, very safe means of communication. And my, how the world also changed. So that is why we have to see that this current technologies, this digital technologies, should be a part of our life. At the same time, not creating social distance, but physical distance is required at the present, and not the social distance. So let us be socially together, and that way, in that sense, and let us gear up to come out of this plight, and this come out of this major problem which not only India but all the countries of the world have faced. But the solution will be at the local level only. So India has to gear up, and there should be a major shift in policy making, along with what the people, change in attitude of the people. That's thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing those observations with us. I now request Dr. Moitri De, our moderator for this session, to take over from here and begin the proceedings. Dr. Moitri.
Yeah, thank you, Manisha. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words. A very good morning to everyone. Once again, we welcome you all to this webinar on impact of COVID-19, a perspective. The first impact is the rising importance of the virtual world through which we are connected. This has now become the norm of the day. So here we are connected through this webinar focusing on the pandemic and its implications. Under the able leadership of our principal ma'am, we have been conducting a series of webinars. This webinar is in continuity to that. As we all know that the pandemic has impacted all over the world, some positive impacts are that we have clean air to breathe, we can hear birds chirping, we get quality time with our family, and above all, getting back to our old hobbies. At the same time, this has also badly affected the economy, employment, the migrant labor issue, health of those infected with the virus, which is of great concern. So in this scenario, we have to understand the many facets of this pandemic. The world might be in throes of a pandemic, but that hasn't stopped the world from planning for a post-COVID world. And India is one of the key players in this new world order. So in this context, Professor Badrul Alam will throw more light on this aspect, followed by Professor Amita Singh, who will be giving us more insights on the policy initiatives taken up by the government of India and its implications. She will also highlight the renewed debate on the center-state relations in the wake of this pandemic. Without taking much time, I would like to introduce Professor Badrul Alam to you. Professor Badrul Alam is the former head of the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia. He has done his double MA in History and Government and completed his PhD in American Studies from Cornell University, New York. He was the ICCR India Chair, Russian State University for Humanities, Russia in 2017. He was a visiting fellow DAG under a New Passage to India program, University of Wolfsburg, Germany in May 2012 and 2015 as well. He was a visiting fellow, Winston-Salem State University, University of North Carolina, USA, Japan Institute for Social and Economic Affairs, Tokyo, Japan, National Chengde University, Taipei, Taiwan. Sir also has many books, articles, research, publications, book reviews, and many more to his credit. I'm just briefing up the introduction. So I hand over the mic to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Maitri, for a very generous introduction. First of all, I would like to thank and compliment Mata Sundari College, Principal Harpreet Kaur, and all the organizers of this particular webinar, Manisha, Rosalind, Maitreyi, and all the people who are involved with this particular enterprise. I think it's a very important topic that we are talking today on COVID-19 and its impact. So I would really like to thank each one of you. And it's also very nice for me, a great feeling that Professor Amita Singh and Professor Rumki Basu and a lot of our students, they will also be joining and taking part. Maybe you can listen something useful from them also. Coming back to this particular topic, what I'll do is I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. And I'll talk basically impact of COVID-19 in India from an international IR perspective. And after my presentation, we'll listen to Professor Amita Singh, and then thereafter there will be Q&A session, and I'll be very happy to take questions and try to respond to the best of my abilities. This is a huge topic, and this is a huge canvas. Just for first few minutes, I think, as the Principal Kaur ma'am said, COVID-19 has become the new normal. I mean, this has changed entirely the entire universe in social, economic, political, cultural, in any context that you can think of. In every possible countries. We did have a lot of pandemic before. We had SARS, we had H1N1, we had Ebola, we had Spanish flu. But I think this one was very, very different. I mean, this one has affected the big power, the middle power, the small powers, everybody, north, south, east, west, and nobody has been spared. And nobody knows exactly when the curve will be flattened. I mean, so we thought after the lockdown 1, things will get better, maybe it got worse. Now we are in lockdown 5, so we just don't know. I mean, so this has become a new normal, but we have to live with the realities like just the way we have to live with this virtual world. And and that's an accepted norms, and within that perimeters, within that, as Maitreyi said at the beginning, that paradigm shift, I think we have to operate and we have to try to make the best out of this particular situation. So what I will do is I will just flag up some important points and that India has tried to deal with, or India lives with, within this regional or global context, and certain things are of course are beyond our control. So what I'll do is I'll try to begin with, for example, I am a student of IR, International Politics and International Relations. In any class, I think all of our students, they know that in international relations, we begin with some mainstream theories. For example, the realist theory, the neo-realist theory, the constructivist theory. For example, very briefly, when we talk about realism, in IR, if you read the book of Kenneth Walsh or Joseph Nye or whoever, we talk about national interest. We talk about power, all kinds of power, soft power, hard power, okay, smart power. We talk about national interest, the core national interest. We talk about survival. We talk about self-help. Okay. We also talk about anarchic societies that we have to operate. Okay, like a Hobbesian society. Then how to make the best use of it, because this is not a perfect world, it is less than perfect. Then we came up with Keohane's neo-realist theories, which talks all of the above that the realists talked about. Plus, on the top of that, we also came to know about that power by itself is not adequate, it is not enough. National interest is not enough. We have to go beyond that. We have to go one step further. We have to have something called capabilities. Okay. And then we have got other wave of theories, for example, like constructivist theory. They say power is important, national interest is important, survival is important, capabilities are important. But beyond that, ideas and norms are also important, because they also shape the way a foreign policy or a international politics of a particular country it operates in the external dimension or in the external will. So I think with that particular context, with that particular backgrounds, I would like to come up with India. I think Indian foreign policy, I think if you look back, I think if you look at broad trajectory of India's foreign policy right from 1947 until today, which is what, 2020, some 60, 70 years, like 7 decades, I think we have gone through a lot of waves. Like if you see the first 15, 20 years, like the Nehruvian age, we talked about during the Cold War, we talked about non-alignment, we talked about having good relations with all of the different countries, we talked about Panchsheel, five principles, maintaining equidistance from both Soviet Union and also United States, and also trying to have cultivate good relations with everybody, because we are a growing nation. We cannot afford to alienate any particular big powers at that particular time. Then came the big awakening with 1962, the Sino-Indian War. Okay, and then we have this approach. Let us say from mid 60s to early 90s, we have got this period of self-help, and in between we have got war with Pakistan in 65 and 71. We have got different prime ministers with different mindset and different thrust, both domestically as well as in externally also. Then in 1990s, I think we have come with a new dimension with the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the post-Cold War in 1991, in which United States was the sole hegemonic power, as the sole superpower. We have got the process of globalization, privatization, liberalization in place, both good and bad and ugly, everything all mixed up. Then we have got new dimensions also in foreign policy, like Look East policy, which was during Sushma Swaraj time. We have got this Act East policy. And then we have coming to the post-Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh phase 2, Vajpayee years, then Manmohan Singh, then Modi 1 and Modi 2. So we are at this particular juncture. I think we have come a big way in terms of making foreign policy in tune with the changing times and changing circumstances. And we have tried to blend both pragmatism as well as real politics, because we felt that just putting all eggs in one basket is not enough, is not adequate, and we have to go beyond that. That's why you saw the Look East policy, because traditionally India's foreign policy has been Look West. But in addition to Look West, we also look for Look East, beyond South Asia, beyond SAARC, ASEAN, and maybe beyond ASEAN in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, all those countries, Vietnam, etc. Also in terms of energy security, for example, which is a very important issue, particularly in the 21st century, we also tried to sign up with Indo-US civil nuclear deal. That is again a game changer. That was again a big shift forward. The 1998, you can say about the Pokhran 2 explosion, when India officially proclaimed nuclear capabilities also. So I think if I go back and forth, okay, the diasporic diplomacy that Prime Minister Modi has been launching for the last 6 years, okay, and we'll discuss that in a while. So I think if you see it, we have come with more idealism phase in the 1950s and 60s to more self-help approach, then more pragmatic approach, and now it's a more real political approach. And the same thing, if you look back in the traditional concept of non-alignment, now we have got something, as you all know, non-alignment 2.0, which emphasizes on strategic autonomy. That yes, we are autonomous, we can take our own decisions, but we also have to be strategic. Just because we are friendly with a country A does not mean that we have to be alienating or have some adverse relation with country B. It is quite possible to have both A and B together, looking into our own core national interest. For example, for a long time, India had a traditional relations, vibrant relations with the Arab countries, and it was a big taboo to have relations with Israel. But today, there is a time when we have got good relations with all the Arab countries, from the Gulf countries to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, Iraq, everywhere. Plus, we also have a very strong, robust relations with Israel also. Our Air India flies above the Saudi Arabian airspace to Israel, which was unthinkable 5, 10, or 20 years ago. So I think that shows the maturity of India's foreign policy, India's international relations in that respect. Next, I will talk about India's power quotient. Okay, most of the times, I think when we talk about India's power, I think mostly in the last 20, 30 years, we talked about the hard power. Like, for example, Joseph Nye, he talked about hard power like a power of coercion. Like when we say about United States of America is a very powerful industrial military complex, because they have got all kinds of weapons, all kinds of arsenals at their respect. I think in India's case, I think just let me give you a few examples of India's hard power. India is among the top 10 armies of the world and currently ranked 4th in terms of manpower, technology, firepower, training, resources, military hardware. We have got nuclear capabilities, nuclear deterrence we have, in addition to conventional deterrence, how to deter your potential enemy, whether it is Pakistan or China or anybody else. Okay, missile capabilities, all the way from Agni 1 to Agni 2, all the way to Agni 5, with more than 5,000 kilometers of range. That means literally it is possible from any point of India. India is now in a position to hit any part of China or any part of Central Asia or any part of Southeast Asia, plus the Indian Ocean. Development of ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarine facilities, not many countries have, but India does have at this point of time. NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, to fight chemical, biological, nuclear warfare. India's defense cooperation with a number of countries, including US, Israel, Russia, France, UK. Military exercises on a continuous basis with a variety of countries. And I was surprised that even India does have a ongoing annual military exercise, even with China also, okay, which will come in a minute, on land, air, and sea, anti-piracy operation in the high sea. So these are just some examples of India's hard power that has also put India at a top league. Now coming to India's soft power, again, going back to Joseph Nye, he defines soft power as a policy of attraction. So I think 20 years ago, 30 years ago, nobody thought about the soft power. India did have a lot of soft power, but nobody noticed that. So now that the soft power has got a new catchword, a new buzzword kind of things, now we are talking about the soft power in terms of India's public diplomacy, India's music, India's literature, Bollywood, India's democratic tradition, open society, Indian cuisine, textiles, exports, media, education sector, India's diaspora, people like Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Kautilya, splendid diversity, multiculturalism, unity in diversity, truth, tolerance, humanism, ahimsa, Ayurveda, yoga, cricket, and spirituality. I think I can go on and on. Maybe some of you can also make some other additions. So I think what India is doing is is having a judicious mix of both hard power and soft power to make it a more smart diplomacy. I think that's what you have been doing in the last 10 or 15 years of this government and the government before also. And I think they're doing the right path in that particular direction for an upward trajectory or upward movement of India's foreign policy. Next, I will talk about, if you read any books or any articles or any journals, or if you listen to any TV debates these days also, you talk about this polarity theories. As I told you a few minutes ago, during the Cold War years, roughly from 1945 to 1990, we had a bipolar world. Basically, at the end of World War II, that's the way the powers distributed among the United States of America and Soviet Union. After the demise of Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, we have got a unipolar world again. So bipolar to unipolar. But today in the 21st century, we have got a huge amount of multipolar things. And some people, they say it is not only multipolar, but it is also multilateral. And a scholar like Amitabh Acharya, he says this is also a multiplex world also. And I'll describe to you what do you mean by multiplex world in a minute. So in terms of multilateralism, you see the UN was created in 1945. It is still there, but there has been a lot of questions about the United Nations, its viabilities, its limitations. We have got some of the agencies of UN, for example, WHO. There are debates going on. Donald Trump has withdrawn his financial support and funding to the WHO. There are some other countries, they have got questions about WHO, that they are maybe having some bias towards China, on UNESCO also. So I think we have got debates on different these multilateral organizations and also regional organizations, about SAARC, about ASEAN, about GCC countries, about many other OAS, etc. Then this multiplex world, I think that's a very interesting notion. Basically, multiplex world is like a multiplex theater where you have got many shows happening simultaneously. We have got various actors, various directors. It is a multiplex world in the sense no single power or no single authority is the determining authority. United States is important, but it is not the determining factor. It is not the sole hegemon. It is not dictating the whole thing. We are living in a more shared kind of atmosphere. We are living in a more interconnected and interdependent world in which US is a very important player, but not the only important player. There are other important players also, both in the upper tier, also in the middle tier, and also in the lower tier. So we should not look at the power only in terms of East-West relations, but rather North-South and even South-South relations also, between developing and underdeveloped countries also. So in these multiplex countries, we have got great powers, you have got nation states, you have got NGOs, you have got civil societies, you have got other transnational bodies. So I think all of them, they have enriching things in this particular multiplex world in which everybody is a stakeholder in varying degrees kind of thing. So I think India is also a part of all of this. And I think that comes to my next point that you must be reading in the last couple of weeks, that India, for example, is a member of number of regional bodies. For example, India is a member of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. China is a very important partner, a viable partner in the BRICS forum. And we do have regular BRICS meetings in various parts of the BRICS countries. We are also an important member of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. With China also, we engage both cooperation and conflict in many important forums, including WTO, etc., etc. Recently, I think two things that comes to my mind, I think, which I would like to bring to your attention. One is the Quad. Quad stands for quadrilateral, meaning there are 4 countries, which is United States of America, Australia, Japan, and India. So this is they have been engaged in the 2+2 dialogue with the foreign ministry and the defense ministries, and in a lot of this geoeconomic and geostrategic perspectives in the last couple of years. So that is Quad. And recently, there has been a proposal, let us expand the Quad from the 4 countries that I just said, from USA to Australia to Japan and India, to 3 more countries, namely South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. And with each of these countries, they are also very, very important countries, and they do have good relations with US, with Australia, with Japan, and also with India. So I think these 4 countries, and also very recently there was a very interesting suggestions from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, that the G7 meetings, let us try to expand that membership into G11. Maybe it will end up with G10, we don't know. So basically G7 was like the kind of, you can say, like a economically affluent countries or industrialized countries like US, Canada, Great Britain, France, Japan, okay, Italy, okay. But a lot of people say, I think some of these countries, for example, Italy, I mean, how can you include Italy in today's contemporary power equation as a very important player? Maybe some more countries should be there. So what I think President Trump suggested a few days ago was that let us expand G7 into G11 by including countries like India, Australia, South Korea, maybe Russia. Russia was actually a member of G7, but due to the incident in Crimea, I think it was suspended. But now I think President Trump wants to bring Putin back to this particular group. So let us see, I mean, how that thing shapes out. So you have got the Quad, the issue of Quad plus and Quad plus, but at the same time, you have also got the issue of this G7, G11, and we already have a G20 get together. I think a lot of discussions take place. At the same time, I think you also have to balance it with BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, or some people say OBOR, One Belt, One Road concept that China has been developing, particularly the leader Xi Jinping, since 2013. In fact, he started out with a very ambitious enterprise with a venture of more than $1 trillion. And that was sprinkled across all the countries in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and many other countries, okay? For both economic corridors and also strategic expansion, etc., etc. So now the question is, I mean, which I am coming to the next is, and that is also very, very important for India's international relation, is how to deal with China, okay? Should we exclude China? Should we include China? You know, during the Cold War years, we talk about containment. Okay, George F. Kennan and many scholars, they talk about containment, how to contain communism, how to both Soviet Union, Soviet communism as well as Chinese communism in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, Indochina, etc., etc. So that is one way, how to contain communism, okay, how to contain China, Chinese influence, increasing influence all over the world. At the same time, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we see China is like a big elephant, it's all over. So how to engage China? And some people say just having one policy like a zero-sum game is not a good policy. Rather, we should have a combination of both containment and engagement, meaning, and some people, they call it a policy of congagement. So that you need both, you need to contain China, trying to curtail its influence in Southeast Asia, in different parts of the world. At the same time, you need to engage it. So that's why, that is the argument that when I was reading in some newspapers or in some journals, that we need to take advantage of the Wuhan controversy or whatever is happening in China in terms of the PR or whatever it is. I mean, China is probably at a very weak wickets right now. So we need to marginalize those kind of things. But there is also another compelling argument that says we should not fall into the trap of the US and trying to marginalize and completely sideline China. Rather, we should develop a policy which should be a China plus policy, in which China should be a stakeholder, China should be an important member, okay? And at the same time, we try to moderate the behavior of China and trying to push it and accommodate and trying to find areas of convergence for a shared leadership kind of thing. So I think because China is there, China has influences in South China Sea, China has interest in Indian Ocean, it has got friends in Central Asia, in Russia, in Southeast Asia, among all the ASEAN countries and many parts of the world. So I think it will not be a wise decision to completely marginalize the, China at this particular juncture. That is my submission. Now talking about the US and India, they have been natural friends, they have been partners, there has been off-again, on-again relationship if you look back in the last 50, 60, 70 years. But I think in the last 10, 15, 20 years, I think since Bill Clinton's visit and George W. Bush, the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, and then Prime Minister Modi's visit to US and developing a good personal chemistry with President Trump in both Howdy Modi event in Houston and also Namaste Trump in Ahmedabad, and in all other defense and all other sectors. I think it is on a upward trajectory. I think my submission is, even if in November Trump is defeated and Joe Biden gets elected, I think the Indo-US relation is in a very solid state, and it has already in the last 20, 30, 40 years, in spite of whether it is Democrats or Republicans, it has attained a bipartisan support. So it doesn't matter whether it is the Democrats who is in power in the White House or the Republicans. The Indo-US relation has developed a more matured kind of relationship. So we used to hear about engaged democracy, strength democracy. We also used to hear about the American foreign policy is a little bit incoherent, little bit inconsistent, and a lot of times the American policy, and that is a criticism against America, that they always pursue a policy of transactional politics, like a business transaction. I give you this, you give me back, like a reciprocal kind of thing. It is more like episodic kind of things. So they don't see the long duration kind of thing. So that has been a criticism of American foreign policy. But I think if you look back in the last 10, 20, 30 years, particularly in the 21st century, maybe the United States has realized that the 19th century was basically a European century. The 20th century was kind of American century. And this particular century, the 21st century, the America is important, but it is not that important. If you look in the scale of 1 to 10, maybe it is somewhere like 4, 5, 6. And the top 3, 4 countries are all Asia. And maybe a lot of people, they say this century, the 21st century, is the Asian century. And the 3 countries that are ruling will be ruling the 21st century, or will be dominating, will be China, India, and Japan, or maybe South Korea. Okay, and we'll see in the next 20 or 30 years, from the intermediate to the long term, as to who becomes number 1, who becomes number 2, and who becomes number 3. And again, talking about both US and China vis-a-vis India, I think, I just coined the term of hegemon. Hegemon means you are the single boss, you are the sole mighty power. But a lot of people say America is now a declining power, or it is already a declined power. So now, how China wants to balance the relationship vis-a-vis America and other countries. Does he like to be a co-hegemon, or a co-leader, or a co-partner, or a co-facilitator, or go genuinely for a shared leadership in an interconnected and interdependent world? So I think that remains to be seen. I think that we'll see in the post-COVID world, probably in the next 3 to 5 years, okay? Whether China or America, they like to be sole hegemon, or co-partner, or co-facilitator, or genuinely go for a shared partner, shared leadership, also involving India. And plus, I think there are other powers also which are also equally important, which I would call middle powers. For example, Canada, for example, Singapore, for example, Taiwan, for example, Australia and New Zealand. So I think these are all important, significant power on their own right at different parts of the world, and you have to see how we can juggle up Brazil, Argentina, Egypt. I think all of them are very, very important, these middle powers. And I think they also play very important roles. Next, I think I'll jump into the 2 things, India and the advent of globalization. Professor Rumki Basu, when she wrote a book on the era of globalization, the role of the state. Okay, so a lot of people, we are lamenting that the state's power has increased significantly. Then there was a time when the state power was diluted and diminished, and everybody was shedding tears. Now, this COVID has again brought the state back from the front door, from the back door, from the side door. So again, state is playing a very assertive role. So we don't know how this particular thing is going to play out, whether it is going to be good or bad, beneficial or not beneficial. I think the time will tell. I think another term.
Sir.
Yes.
So maybe you can sum up in the
next. So that's another 5 minutes, and I will be done. Okay.
Okay. Sure, sir. Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. So I think there is another interesting term is called globalization. Okay. Think global and act local. Okay. So maybe globalization has its own merits, has its own downsides. Maybe localization. Okay, like as Prime Minister said the other day, let us be vocal about local. So maybe we need to have also local. Maybe we need to combine, as I said, like China thing, containment and engagement, like making a hybrid kind of thing, like a engagement. Maybe globalization and localization, we need to have a glocalization. The Prime Minister, again, the other day, he said, Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think we all believe that. Our parents, they say, okay, self-reliant, stand on your own leg, move on your own, okay? Do your basic things like that. I think that's a great idea. That's a great concept of Atmanirbhar. Okay, but I think that itself is not going to be sufficient. That is not going to be adequate. It is a great idea. It's a wonderful concept. But I think that has to be supplemented with something else. Like, for example, when we go into the market like Delhi Haat or any other places, okay? So I think what we need is a lot of us, I think particularly the new generations like you, I think you will need both. You need Gucci, you also need Khadi. So we need both Gucci and Khadi. We need both Campa-Cola and Coca-Cola and Campa-Cola. We need both Kirana store. We also need Big Basket. I think both the things can coexist. That's why I said both globalization and localization, and we need to have a more hybrid kind of thing called glocalization. And I think that really will suit in this particular concept. The last point that I will make at this point of time is, what is India now? Is it a big power, small power, aspiring power, motivational power? A lot of people say emerging power. I will give you an interesting anecdote. In the late 20th century, around I think 1996, 97, an American scholar that you know of, Stephen Cohen. Steve Cohen, he wrote a book called India, an Emerging Power. That book is a nice fancy title. I used to use that in my classes. And the book's title ended with a question mark. India, an Emerging Power by Stephen Cohen. That was published around 96, 97 on that. Okay. The same book was republished with a second edition, new edition, around 2005 or 6. Okay. The title was the same. Everything was the same. The author is the same. Guess what? The only thing that was missing is the question mark at the end of emerging power is gone. And I think that says something, that India has come a long way since the late 90s to the early 20th century, 21st century, and into the beyond. India is now a more assertive power. India can stand on its own leg. India can take its own interest, okay? India does not have to be a zero-sum game. India doesn't have to apologize for doing this and that. I think as long as that particular thing stands, I think we're in the right wicket. But at the same time, this particular COVID environment, I think we need to watch it very, very carefully, and we should not rush into kind of things. The Shiv Shankar Menon said the other day, I think the whole world has become more poorer and meaner and leaner kind of things. I think so we have to really navigate very, very carefully, and we have to see how the foreign policy trajectory goes. But I think the fundamentals are very strong. They are very, very sound. I think to this particular comment, I think let me end at this particular point, okay? So thank you so much for listening to me. I'll be more than happy to take questions during the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir has very rightly said that India is not anymore an emerging power, and sir has also summed up the India's power structure with its various other countries, not only China or USA, but also the Middle East and all. So, and also sir has explained very nicely in such a short time how India's soft power can be an asset to us. With this, thank you so much, sir. I would like to introduce Professor Ramita Singh. Ma'am actually has so many things in her, so many things, but we have summarized her CV in a short one slide. Ma'am is a professor of law and governance, founder chairperson of the Special Center for Disaster Research, and member secretary of Institutional Ethics Review Board at JNU. She has also been the longest serving Secretary General, the Asia Pacific Governance Network, NEPSI-PAC, started by ADB. She has worked closely with the ARPG, DFID, and the Global Innovators Network at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, Maryland University, Baltimore, and the University of Southern Australia, Adelaide, Australia. She has also been awarded the Australia-India Council and Australian Government Monash Fellowship twice, once in 2006-07 and 2016. Ma'am is also a campaigner for non-human species, and she is also leading an organization in Gurgaon. And she has many books, research articles. She is also board of many review boards of many publications. Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us this time. And the mic is all yours, ma'am.
Moitri, thank you very much. And also, because your principal, Dr. Harpreet Kaur, she's already summarized COVID-19 very succinctly and elaborated on points very carefully. I'll have a few areas where I can focus upon. And to all the organizers, thank you very much, Rosaline, Manisha, and Ishpreet. Sorry if I miss out anyone. The biggest challenge for a webinar, being in a webinar, is to find the least clustered area, a corner in your house, where the pets are not occupying it. So, for me, it's really a great thing to be here in a webinar. It's an opportunity for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, responses of various governments to COVID-19. And this COVID-19 has, of course, split the world into so many segments. It's also atomized the policy structure. It has also brought the deep arrogance of law and governance onto the surface. It has also brought the class structure so far hidden in the society out in the open. So I don't know where to begin with, but I call it a Pavlovian approach, a knee-jerk approach of government to COVID-19. Because as far as I can analyze, over the period of 3 months and looking at it from outside, I was in US and I was watching what India is doing, constantly having my interaction with the local scholars in Harvard, where I was supposed to work, is that everyone smiled when I said that, see, the infection rate is just 1.5%. And look at it, we have just 100 people infected. Transmission is so low. And it's so nice that, we would soon be opening up within 20-21 days. And Trump would also going to open up. They said, just wait and see. You would not be ready to open up for the next 6 months or maybe the whole year. And I used to feel very angry on the responses that used to come from the other side. Yes, when the infection rate was as low as 1.5%, the case fatality ratio was even lower than SARS. If you know that what SARS and MERS had done, SARS in 2003 and MERS in 2012, 11-12, and we know that what they had done to the world, and we see that what COVID-19 was doing is, nothing different. When people say it's an unprecedented microbe affecting us, I don't see the difference. And there are lots of people who talk like me, that they don't see that anything is, bombastically different. But we have the Pavlovian approach, and, we are reacting to it, and we are overreacting to it. And let me put down in my arguments why we are overreacting to the challenge. One is that, we've seen that we started late. China had already warned, and WHO had already warned in early January that it's going to be different, because even though, its case fatality ratio is low, it's going to be, the transmission is going to be significantly very strong, and it's going to deepen in the society. Now, what about that WHO report that had warned us on the 12th of January? We were busy somewhere else. Let's accept it. Let's introspect. We were busy somewhere else, so we didn't look at it. And who was doing the work at that time? In the January, we had already started with the thermal screening at the airports. Everyone coming from the countries which were in the eastern side were put to a lot of tests. Then, when we brought inside, then the visas and everything was to some extent suspended, and some of them got, and some were immediately returned. All this activity was going on at the airport. We were not aware of it as commoners, but this was going on. Then we see that what was the argument given to us at that point, we didn't start very early, was that the infection rate was just 1.7%, whereas in China it was about 2.14, Iran was 2.73, Italy was even higher than Iran. So at that point, we thought that a sense of denial, that even if it comes to India, we are very empowered to handle it. How were we empowered to handle it? We did not have enough PPEs, personal protection equipment. We did not have N95 masks. And if we take it on further, there were a lot of problems which needed retrofitting, like hospital beds, isolation wards, temporary shelters, quarantine areas. We did not think on those lines. We were thinking because a task force came up in the mid-March, and that task force had a few ministries, just 7 ministries into it. And those ministries were asked to take care of the PDS. They were asked to, I saw a question coming on the PDS, that ministry was asked to take care of the PDS, of the textile ministry was asked to take care of the masks. And some other ministries were also brought in for, medical equipment, foods, and of course the travel. But there were some states that unilaterally had taken action by then. And these states, Tamil Nadu, Sikkim, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Assam, they said that we're going to stop tourism. Sikkim was the first to stop tourism. Tamil Nadu acted very fast in one way, that it immediately started opening up and appointing doctors, nurses, paramedics. Very fast action was taken in Tamil Nadu. This was not taken at the central level, and a large number of states were still in a sense of denial. So this was one of the problems. And on the 22nd, when the Janta curfew came in, and till 24th, when finally the lockdown came in, immediately shutting back 1.3 billion plus people in their lockdowns. That was a major thing. Nobody ever in the world could have. And what a lack of preparedness with which it was imposed. We did not think about, 90 lakhs on the roads, temporary sheds, living in developing areas, the so-called the crucible growth, the metropolitan areas. Where would they go? Only their wages stop. And that's why I call it a Pavlovian knee-jerk approach, because nobody thought about it. And we had the task force, but the task force at no point mentioned the wage labor. And this was the reason why recently a very serious criticism has come on this kind of an approach from Indian Public Health Association, epidemiologists from AIIMS, Community Prevention Medicine Organization. They have together put in a case against the government to say that your task forces did not have enough number of people who could advise you better. The consultation did not take place. And I have added to it that they did not have the social scientists, they did not have the people working on gender, they did not have the people working on labor. And there is a virtual bloodshed in the labor market. And I'll come to it. The second part of my talk is on economic losses when I deal with this separately. But about this knee-jerk approach, I also add to it that the lockdown did not come severely only to the wage laborers. Of course, for them, it was an issue of survivability. Lots of them, thousands of them lost their lives in accidents, in disease, in starvation, lack of food. But it came equally strong on the relatively better off privileged people as well, because they were locked down wherever they were. The travel options stopped, the flights stopped, trains stopped, buses stopped. There are so many of known people who were blocked in Bangalore. They had gone there for work, their child left alone in Delhi, and like that, it's not similar, but it was equally torturous in many ways. Then it took the government almost a month or a little more to start the massive Vande Bharat approach. And along with that, Samudra Setu approach. Big name, sounds so big. Vande Bharat started repatriating citizens from other countries by the 7th of May. And Samudra Setu, the Indian Navy came forward. The forces, of course, have always been in the forefront. They always do very good work, and I put a very supportive word for them. Air India, also a very supportive word for Air India. It was about to be sold off just before COVID-19. And during COVID-19, they were the first ones to come and repatriate all people back home. What a phenomena went going down into a lot of misunderstanding of governance. And Samudra Setu got people from UAE and Maldives. So, phenomenally, a good work started after the 7th of May. But the question remains, was this torturous harassment of people locked down in other countries a good thing to do, even if it was avoidable? Now, they say that we've been flattening the curve. Where is the curve flattened? Now, do we have enough studies to say that if these people were brought in, now 24th was the lockdown start day, it could have been within a week, these people could have been brought, or they could have been told that it's time for you to return. The flights are not stopping for the next one fortnight. We are trying to apply the cluster approach to the prevention to transmission of the micro. And in the meantime, people may be brought back home in a safer surroundings, both the wage laborers and those stuck abroad. And Vande Bharat could have come earlier to the planning in the task force itself. There was nothing in the task force talking about what will happen to repatriation. Were people only Delhi-centric? Yeah, governance and public administration has always suffered thinking about Delhi-centric. But I thought that we would always be little more in a globalized world. And this came, it took government almost 1.5 months to think about who is living outside Delhi. They thought Delhi was the hub. Now, after this, I come to the real issue. The question that somebody raised was, what are the prospects of development in coming times? The economic losses because of this COVID-19 have been phenomenal. The unemployment rate, which was just 6.74, of course, 7.4 is not just, we were breaking through the wall saying that 6.74 is huge unemployment rate. That was prior to the COVID. Nearing to COVID, it came 8.74. But do you know what it went to by May 15? Only 8%. Throwing 90 lakh people of job in one go, a virtual bloodbath in the labor industry when crores of people, almost 40 crores of people suddenly drop below the poverty line. Years to say that 1.75 is a reasonable poverty line where we can take care of people, and we were working on talking about labor, talking about wages, and talking about the health sector, converging them together to bring them above the poverty line. And in one decision, we dropped 40 crores below the poverty line. And if that wasn't enough, we see that the labor participation rate, even as the lockdown gradually opens up, is not improving. Because if there are no workers in the cities, what is the use of opening up the lockdown? They've all been thrown out of the cities. Now there are all these service centers. We basically were service industry people in the metropolitan city, and the services have opened up. The lockdown is gradually easing out, but the labor participation rate, which was in the beginning of COVID, was about 43%. Is sorry, it was 43%, has come down to below 39%, which means that we have almost 44.3 crores to 43 crore people, not working right now, even if you offer them jobs. Now, the problem today is to think about whether, we would be in a position to bounce back. Because in every disaster, including this COVID or biological disaster, we are always questioning ourselves, does the economy have the capacity to bounce back? Now let's analyze that. And let's see what the other market agencies have been talking about it. First of all, we see what was the problem. The urban income was already going down prior to the COVID, and the GST issue had already been bringing it down from 5.8% down to 1.9%. And then, if we move further on the infrastructure financial services agencies projections, we see that they had already declared the huge liquidity crisis in the market. Not just because of the income going down, but also because the real estate people had locked up their money in the real estate. Not because new projects are not coming up, because the projects had already been stalled for the last 2 years. Now, this is a phenomenal thing combined with the losses in the farm sector. In 2018, the growth was 0% in the farm sector. In 2017, a year ago, it was 8%. So we are gradually coming down. So now, where is the scope? Of course, in the coming year, farm sector is the only hope left for us. But coming to think about labor participation rate, we are being too presumptuous if we say that we have the capacity to bounce back even the next year. Now, further going into, this rate of GDP, Comptroller and Auditor General data had shown that the gap of earning and spending just at the beginning of COVID was 4.59. Much higher than the budget target of 3.8%. So this is the huge gap. First, we have to fill up the gap and then talk about the target. We are much behind the target. So can we cross the target in 1 year, that which we have not been able to cross in the last 4 years? I think it's too presumptuous to say that. And IMF has already declared that the global economy showdown is -3%, which is going to continue in the coming times. So economic situation is extremely grave, and we have yet to work out on what will take us to the 5 trillion economy. There is a stimulus package that the government declared, 20 lakh crores. Now let's look at the stimulus package of 20 lakh crores. It brings relief, no doubt, because without a stimulus package, we have little hope, little light coming from the positive side. But 20 lakh stimulus package can only be applicable to those who have survived the COVID. But those who have locked down, like MSMEs, the micro, small and medium industries, the micro and small, a large number have already closed down and they are at the verge of closing down. They need support right away. The stimulus package took 2 months to come in.
The stimulus package should have come in the task force discussion itself, that this is going to be happening due to COVID, and this is what we were supposed to do. But it came 2 months later, when the bloodbath has already taken away the lives and livelihood of a large crores of people. Then Goldman Sachs has already projected that economy was already on the shrinking side by 5%. It's shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. It's not going to open up after the COVID. In this situation, even if we are very innovative, and the stimulus package is even doubled, we still have to look at what will actually go to the unorganized sector. This unorganized sector is the major contributor to the economy, and it is also a major contributor to the GDP. There is one more aspect which has been brutally defied. Now, we have brought all the people back home because we were overreacting to COVID, and the remittances that we got. India, if you know, is the top country in receiving remittances from abroad. It's one country in the whole world that receives 84 billion USD per year, which is, considering the economy that we have $2,500 billion economy. And in that, 84 billion is contributed by only our people abroad. The kind of systems and obstructions in free transfers that we've created, and then the way the people are rushed back home with nothing to offer them from the country, there is going to be a serious damage to a large number of earnings from this area. So the scope is fairly limited. The government should have wider consultative arenas of involving not just economists, but also social scientists, grassroots workers, NGOs who have been working with communities, and make its task force little more with these people than with only the IAS administrators and the top scientists from ICMR. With that, I come to my last part, which is the socio-political consequences. In socio-political consequences, of course, we are seeing one of the biggest social consequences, a new form of revival of untouchability. It is, of course, not caste-based, but it is based on, maybe a class-based, because, you need a lot of money to buy sanitizers, to buy masks again and again, to travel in the way, to bathe in a way. These were people who had been living a very survivability concerned life. Now, how would we overcome that? The stigma, as we studied in one city, the stigma was also related to, the treatment of the infected people by medico-policing. A moment it was realized that somebody is infected, the Arogya Setu app went into action, the local police station, the local paramedics sprung into action. There was siren honking, ambulance at the door of the person. There was a board put outside the person's house, and everyone said, who? You must have seen the news about JNU recently. And why was the media so much concerned about one person getting infected in JNU? Is JNU an island? Now, this kind of thing created stigmatization of poor people. The poor people preferred to commit suicide, stay indoors, or not tell anyone. But was it possible? No, it was not possible, because the government had already, on the 11th March onwards, had invoked an act which was 123-year-old, EDA Act, and Epidemic Disease Act, a colonial era act, is the smallest act ever that a law person can study, half a page. Now, what was so dangerous about the EDA Act, which we did not have the power to do in a regular constitutional situation? EDA Act, Section 2, Section 3, and Section 4. 3 and 4 are extremely draconian, that if you refuse to abide by the policies of the local administrators, then you will be imprisoned, put behind bars, and fined. Now, this creates a lot of fear. If I say, I'm not a COVID patient, please stay away. No, you are a COVID patient because you have been tested positive by our private laboratory. So you have to come along with us. And you are taken to a hospital, and then after 3-4 days, the more tests conducted on you, thousands of money gone, and you are negative. Then you are brought back home, but they would not change your status on Arogya Setu app. And because of that, you are constantly under surveillance. Now, imagine a poor person who is a daily wager, who's working in somebody's home. Nobody want them even in the houses where they are living on rented accommodation. A precarious, sad, precarious situation for them. This is never thought of because administration is completely on a class structure, and those who realize it at the rank and file level, they are not the decisive people. And I hope that if this lecture is heard by the district magistrates or the people in power, they should start thinking in a great sensitivity towards everyone in the hierarchy. Now, I would then come lastly to a legal point. Was EDA required? 1897 EDA required? I would say no, and I have reason for that, that if EDA is not applied, then don't we have enough power to the central government to say that yes, in question, wherever there is inconsistency or there is a conflict between the center and the state, centers will prevail. You read Article 246 to Article 254 in the Constitution, and you'll come to a conclusion that under the concurrent list, entry 29 clearly says that if the state law is repugnant to the center's law, the centers will prevail. So what is the need? Why are you so insecure about the fact that the state government will say no to your laws? We have cooperative federalism in our constitution, but at the same time, there are enormous powers given to the center to make its will imposing on the state. And it is not just that. The National Disaster Management Authority, which came up with the lockdown through the MHA notification, applied Section 2A and also later 10. And under these two sections of the Disaster Management Act 2005, there is ample power to the NDMA to impose its will on the state disaster management authorities and also take preemptive action to prevent the spread of the biological disaster. Initially, there was a lot of confusion about the use of terminologies. They said that does biological disaster, and that of course took a lot of time, is biological disaster a disaster? Now, in 1999, much before the setup of NDMA, and again in 2011 by NDMA itself, there is a clear-cut section on a discussion on biological disasters, which spread very fast, which affect ecosystems, health of people, their health disasters, and NDMA could have looked into its own files and see that yes, what has been said by people in the past. Let's take note of it. Another problem that at the level of NDMA which came in, the members of NDMA have not been picked up from the communities. Even though we have clear indicator from Hyogo Declaration and also in the Sendai, Hyogo says that community connection is a very important thing, because community treatment, community localization, and community bounce back resilience is an important aspect of disaster management. Very similar to that, taking it forward in the Sendai meet in 2015, we have risk identification as number one objective. Now, in risk identification, who would identify the risk? Would you think that, the National Vector-Borne Disease Control Organization or National Communicable Disease Organization or ICMR would go down to the communities to identify a disease? Local people will identify a disease. Local doctors would do that. But they were not brought into the fold of consultation by the members of National Disaster Management Authority and even by the Secretary of the National Disaster Management Authority. As a result of which, this huge lacuna that came in the implementation of the policy leaves not just gaps, but gulfs to be repaired. And the bottom-up approach that we have always been insisting in disaster management have been cut short for their lifetime by applying a top-down approach. And this top-down approach has been a major problem, and it is better for the government to bounce back with a more consultative task forces and by involving communities, NGOs, and a large number of these people who are working at the grassroots level, and ask them what should be the next step. This is equally true for the labor market. This is equally true for disease control, health sector. This is equally true for the academia and the schools and the daycare centers at the grassroots. Thank you very much. That completes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for highlighting all everything about India's preparedness to tackle the pandemic, and also you have very nicely sum up the economic situation, also the renewed debate on center-state relations, and also the policy initiatives. We can now take up questions. There are too many questions which are pouring in. So shall I start with the question, ma'am? Sir?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. There's a question for sir. Sir, I want to understand the political implications or changes in political structure as a result of COVID-19. Can this lead to some form of a surveillance state or to pose severe hindrance to citizens' freedoms?
Should I answer, or you would put all the questions and then I answer all of them together? Why don't you take all the questions together?
Okay, yeah, that will be fine then.
So some may be overlapping questions.
Okay, there was also a question on, ma'am, if you can highlight on the PDS system in solving the hunger through community kitchen among the marginalized, especially in the villages.
Mm-hmm.
And also there is a question on how would trade protectionist policy would affect global markets in current crisis and after.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a question. I can repeat the question, sir, if you
No, I'm noting them down so that I can take them all together.
Okay, the question is for sir as well.
You can address the questions to me at one go so that I am able to answer.
Okay, that will be there. Okay. So there is a question for ma'am. New Zealand recently announced itself as corona-free. What can India learn from New Zealand? And ma'am, there is another question. According to you, what step should be taken to overcome COVID-19? And there is an interesting question for you, ma'am. What will be the future of reversed migrant workers in short and long term due to the so-called pandemic? Is there possibilities to generate employment opportunities in rural India? If they are going back to their workplaces in near future, how to mitigate it? And also, last question for you, ma'am. armed forces could have been used more effectively in this disaster situation in terms of the huge pool of doctors, nurses, and hospitals infra they already have, instead of using them for mere symbolism of on May of 3rd.
Okay. All right. That's all.
Yeah. So maybe I'll read out Sir's question later
Um,
once you address them.
Okay.
No, I have taken down all the questions. First is a question on the PDS and the food security. Food security, this is something that needed a lot of preparedness. And in all my writings, I've been emphasizing that the disaster management authorities in this country have not been adequately prepared to handle the food security system. Even though there have been a lot of activism going on for the last decade and a half on providing food security. Now, PDS system would mean that the COVID-19 should have immediately recharged the local authorities to distribute at least 30 kg of grains immediately to people. What is happening today that if you pass by the highways of the villages, you would find villagers asking you, because it hasn't reached most of the places and most of the homes, because even the villagers have not reached their homes till now. So the problem is extremely acute, and this could have been sorted out if the PDS hotspots could have been created in different areas, little more decentralized areas. And the government should have opened up its strings more generously to the call of the times, which has not happened. Now, second is that the protection policy and how it would impact the local market. I would say that the protection policy is all over the world, and we've become very segregated right now. There is a lack of interaction, and even though our foreign reserves are brimming to the top, the reserve has already declared that the coming times are not going to be good enough, and we may have to shrink a lot of our demands. Now the thing is that demand is not coming up. New demand, which was already shrinking. New demand was already January, February. If you look at the CRISIL report and the Reserve Bank, demand was already shrinking. The local demand was shrinking. Now, in that situation, how do we expect the local markets, because the local demand is extremely low by 4% and below. So I don't know what the government would do. That's for the economists to sit down and talk about it more sincerely across party lines, how to save the nation on that. The third is the New Zealand model. Well, I would say here that take up the model of every country led by a woman. All doing very well. Look at Taiwan, look at New Zealand, because they have applied the bottom-up approach. They have applied the community-level approach. They have applied the family-level approach. It's not clusters which are to be created artificially, cosmetically, to feed an administrator's whim supply. These are naturally coming up because these are women leaders, think very deeply, and they have really done it very well. And I wish that, but I think when, I can't say, a big question mark, I'll leave that here. It's better I'll leave that here. Fourth is that steps to be taken in times to come for managing COVID. The first step is that a large number of paramedics should be hired. The health system has collapsed at the lower level because it was found that it was non-existent. A large number of places where health services were needed, they were not there. So it would be very nice for governments to come up and set up and focus on the paramedic provisions, local dispensaries, and something like the Mohalla Clinic. I don't know how well it worked, but something like a Mohalla Clinic model to be set in the villages, and that is our first line of defense. The second line of defense is in the PDS system, so that in any crisis, not just COVID, there are more to come. We are already the starting point of dengue, malaria, swine flu. There are lots to come. It's not just a beginning. So bad seasons are yet to come. So at that point, what is the PDS system? So that is the second thing. The third thing, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan has contributed phenomenally to this country. I wonder if Swachh Bharat Abhiyan wasn't there from the last 4-5 years, what would have happened to this country? It was easier to teach them to wash their hands because there was already a plan in action. Something like that. That was a approach, a wonderful approach. Something like that should come up at the local level. And we must have local volunteers, and these local volunteers should come from the colleges, because every have an outreach program of looking after their community. Universities should feed into research to coordinate and to carry it forward by providing leadership to a large number of colleges in the periphery of this country. Then the next question is, how do we bring back the wage laborers to the market? Very difficult, but it can be done. It can be done if the government starts issuing, like a license to live in a city with respect and be assured for a particular period of time. That they are assured that for a particular period of nobody is going to touch them, and they would be supported by government insurance policy, government rent policy, and also food policy. That is the responsibility of the government. It must be a stimulus package for the wage laborers, so that they trust the government and the city and settle down for that number of months. And the last is about the armed forces. Why should we expect armed forces to protect us at the border and also come down and put down COVID-19 kind of epidemics? What is the NDMA doing? We have a large number of armed people over there. They can do the job. The thing is that we need to refurbish, we need to reclaim the lost grounds in NDMA. That how it is done is for our Honorable Prime Minister to decide, because he's heading NDMA and he's got the vision like the Swachh Bharat mission, and he's got the vision, and he should give more attention to retrofitting what is wrong with the NDMA. That completes my questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, sir, I'll take up questions for you.
Okay.
So there are many questions, but we have to limit ourselves. So the first question is, sir, I want to understand the political implications or changes in political structures as a result of COVID-19. Can this lead to some form of a surveillance state or to pose severe hindrance to citizens' freedom? Second question is, sir, how would trade protectionist policy affect global market in the current crisis and afterwards? Third question is, we have seen balance of power, bipolar, unipolar, and multipolar worlds. Now, since you have mentioned the word called multiplex, is it going to be stable, progressive, and peaceful, or more turbulent, unstable, comparatively destructive? Please explain. And also, there is another question for you. There is no alternative to China, but what can be done to deepen our engagement with the European Union? Since this area needs to be explored more, both share the same democratic values, multilateralism, a free market, etc. And the second question is, economic centric, like focusing on blue economy, maritime economy, or does it also have military and strategic perspective also?
Okay, thank you. So I think there is a lot of questions. I think before
there are many questions, so we are limiting ourselves.
Okay, I think basically, I think at the very beginning, first of all, I would like to thank each one of the people who asked me some very good questions. Let me just quickly respond to two of the questions that was posed to Professor Amita Singh. I think she also answered absolutely appropriately. For example, I mean, how do we deal with this, the migrants, okay? And if we need to invite them back, I mean, what is the proper procedure? I think a lot of times what we do is like one step forward and two steps back. I think that's not a very wise decision. We should not have any band-aid approach or any kind of ad hoc kind of approach. I think we should have a plan in place. For example, if the reverse migration takes place, the people come back from UP and Bihar or wherever, back to Delhi or wherever it is, okay? Is there a place for them to stay, okay? And how long they're going to stay? Who is going to pay for the rent? Is there any social security in place? Is there any health insurance in place? So I think there should be at least some kind of concrete assurances, either from the government of India, the state government, or from the owners or whatever it is. I think this should not be left to fend for themselves, just like the way it happened a couple of weeks ago. So I think that's very important to have a very well chalked out and well coherent plan as to if you need to bring them back. I think you should make sure that at least they're in a reasonably livable conditions with all the job protections, etc., and not leave them at the mercy of some kind of COVID-19 or COVID-20 or COVID-21. I think that's important. The second things I would like to quickly comment again that was posed to Professor Amita Singh is the role of the armed forces. I mean, I'm not against it, I think, but I think this should be used with absolute caution and with absolute precaution, and maybe this should not be a first resort. Maybe it should be, the armed forces should be used as a last resort. I think they have been used, for example, there have been cyclones, there have been earthquakes in Bhuj, in Odisha, the super cyclone, and recently the Amphan also. So I think there are also a lot of the paramilitary agencies, for example, the Coast Guards, for example, the NSS volunteers. I think there are many other organizations they can also take part. As Professor Singh said, the NDMA can be given a lead role for that. So not necessarily we can only involve the frontline soldiers who are safeguarding our frontiers in Pakistan or in China or whatever it is. I think that should only be used with absolute caution, only as a last resort, but not as a first choice. Now, coming back to the question that was posed to me is, you talked about the balance of power. I talked extensively about the unipolar, the bipolar, the multipolar. I also talked about the multiplex world. A multiplex world, the way I explained, is like a multiplex cinema with multiple actors, multiple directors, multiple choices, etc., in which the United States is there, but it is not the sole hegemon. It is an important actor. They should recognize that we need to have a shared leadership. We need to have an interconnected world. We need to have an interdependent world. That is, the era of self-dependency is over. So this is, in this particular world, in multiplex world, there are many multiple actors, both at the government and non-governmental levels plus civil society. And we need to give equal importance to all the stakeholders and to move forward. Because if we look back at whatever was there 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, the liberal international order, that is there, but I think that role has also diminished. It has undergone a lot of transformation, a lot of changes, and we need to adapt and we need to co-opt and we need to also accommodate all these competing elements and in that one. So for example, the Brexit thing, the role of America today, the role of Russia, China, Japan, Australia, India, the middle powers I talked about, I think all of this has to be negotiated, all of these things has to be also accommodated. Coming back to another question you asked about the protectionist policy. I think again I said about I know that because of the COVID-19 things, for example, India has adopted very successful, I would say, Prime Minister Modi, the HCQ diplomacy, hydroxychloroquine things. And I think one of the good things he did was the very fast shipment of hydroxychloroquine was sent to all the SAARC countries. Okay. And we do have a lot of sufficient stocks about hydroxychloroquine kind of things. But I think he also diversified it by giving it to a lot of the advanced countries, including the United States. Okay, so I think just protectionist policy by itself is not a very wise policy. Yes, I mean, you can have America first policy, you can have India first policy or Australia first policy, but at the same time, you have to look that you are living in a world in which everybody is interdependent and in which you need X and Y. It doesn't have to be reciprocal like a 50-50, but you also need them. And in many different multilateral forums, there are areas where we agree there are areas also which we don't agree. But at the same time, at the end of the day, we have to live together. We also have to coexist for a variety of reasons, both geo-economic, geostrategic, and geopolitical kind of things. So I think I'm not necessarily against protectionist policies, but at the same time, it has to be protectionist plus. For example, for the government of India, I think Piyush Goyal the other day he said that, look, we are not against this, the FDI, foreign direct investment, special economic zones, getting help for some of the infrastructure projects like Make in India, Skills India, Digital India, smart city projects, you name it. Because we need some of those things, but at the same time, we need to Indianize those kind of itself, so we can have a policy which can be take care of your own indigenous needs, your local needs, your national needs. At the same time, you can diversify, you can also branch out, and you can also push the envelope. Regarding the role of multilateralism in maritime security, yes, I think that's very, very important. For example, I talked about the Quad Plus, and I also talked about the G11 possibilities. A lot of times we talk about the maritime security things, the Indo-Pacific architecture, Indo-Pacific kind of things, okay? China has its own also regional aspirations and also its global ambition with PRI, Belt and Road Initiative, OBOR. Some people say One Belt, One Road Initiative also in the. So yes, I think in the short term to the intermediate term, in the next 5 to 10 years, of course, we'll see a lot of emphasis on maritime security in the Indian Ocean, in Bay of Bengal, in Arabian Sea, and in many parts in the Horn of Africa, etc., etc. So I think maritime security is going to very, very important role. It was there important also 10, 20 years ago. If you recollect, in the immediate aftermath of the Persian Gulf War, okay, the maritime security is important for a free and uninterrupted flow of oil from the Strait of Hormuz all the way to Arabian Sea, to Bay of Bengal, to the Strait of Malacca, etc., etc. So yes, maritime security is important, but at the same time, I think each country, whether it is India or elsewhere, I think they have to fine-tune along with their national interest, with their national needs, sometimes either solo or sometimes in collaboration with other countries. For example, in Indian Ocean currently, we do have some annual exercise called Malabar exercise. And that we do in collaboration with countries like Singapore, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Thailand. So we do have a very robust relation as part of the ASEAN. So it is not like a competing with other people to have a one-upmanship, but at the same time, we need to diversify, we need to cultivate. I think India's neighborhood policy is also hold very well. I think if you look at the SAARC things, solidarity, and I think we have also reached out that we should not be perceived that like we are a big brother in South Asia. We are also, we care and share about other people's pain. India was the first country in few hours to help out Nepal when there was the earthquake. India Prime Minister went to Dhaka, to Bangladesh to sign the Tisca Accord, and we do try to resolve the issues with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, also with Maldives. So I think we need to have a more coexisting policies, but at the same time, I think we are being very oblivious about the national interest, about the needs of our country, and how we can also achieve and realize those kind of interests. So I think I answered most of your questions.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would really take this opportunity to thank both of you for agreeing to my proposal and giving us your valuable time. Now, I would request the convener of this webinar and our teacher in charge of the Political Science Department, Ms. Rosaline Seco, for a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Maitri.
Thank you, Professor
ma'am.
Alam and Professor Amita, ma'am. Thank you for keeping us glued to the screen. Am I audible? Am I visible?
Yes.
I cannot see myself, so I'm not so sure. Yeah, thank you for keeping us glued to the screen all the time. And personally, I am actually an IR person, so I was really glued to your talk, sir. And you have interestingly presented your paper, your discussion, and you have explained it very beautifully. And sir, you have explained from the IR perspective. And yeah, I would like to mention few Sir had mentioned about the change of the entire socio-economic political context across the globe because of COVID-19. And you had mentioned that it has become, it is becoming a new normal for all of us. And also the global pandemic has affected all powers, big, medium, small. Um, and India's foreign policy since 1947 till today, it has undergone significant changes from, idealism towards more pragmatism and realist approach. So you have also took an example from the, from look west to the look east policy, how it has changed. And also, sir, you have mentioned how the shift in the outlook, we have seen, like, for example, the concept and the policy initiative like strategic autonomy and desperate diplomacy that you have mentioned, very, very important. And the world today can be described as multiplex, as you have just answered one of the questions as well. And also, sir, there is, you have mentioned that there's no single power in is determining authority now, because agree to this that America is declining, some powerful countries are declining. So the world has become more interconnected and interdependent. India is a part of a number of regional bodies like BRICS, WTO, ASEAN, etc. And the last 2-3 decades we have seen the emergence of China as world power when it no longer can be ignored. And somewhere people usually describe China is, in Hindi it says soya hua rakshas. So we cannot deny the term and the power of China. And also, sir, you have also explained the Indo-US relations. It has moved towards more solid footing, and it is no doubt India is building that, meeting that relationship, and it has become more matured. And also, Professor Alam had, aptly described that 19th century belonged to Europe, 20th century to America, 21st century, to Asian countries, and I think this is a very important observation. When we say Asian countries, especially India, China, Japan, and maybe South Korea as well, some argue that as America is declining power, which has given some scope for the other small countries to come up, like, for example, smaller, or let's say middle countries like Canada, Taiwan, Brazil, etc. So this becomes a very important point for a multiplex world. And also, last point have where great powers, nation states, civil society organizations, NGOs, transnational actors, they have become a very, very important role. They are playing a very important role, and they are. We cannot neglect them. This is how Sir had beautifully described. And coming to Professor Amita Ma'am, ma'am, we really enjoyed your talk, and you had explained the approaches of the government of India to COVID as a knee-jerk approach, as you have put it, and policy initiatives could have been, taken earlier. And you have also, pointed out that there is some kind of a gap between the government, in taking up, in handling this pandemic. Also, ma'am, you have pointed out that COVID-19 has severely impacted the socio-economic sectors in the country, and the stimulus package took 2 months to come, and by this time, the bloodbath had already taken employment of crores of people, especially the marginalized population. People working in the unorganized sector. And ma'am, you have also mentioned this very shocking and very, very important point, that is 40 crore people have been shuttled below the poverty line. And this is a very good, very important information that you have mentioned. And ma'am, you have also said that the government should have consulted not only with economists, but also with the social scientists, NGOs, and the experts, so that the task would have been properly implemented, and And ma'am, you have also mentioned that in this situation, the conflict between the center state, the state has more power, no doubt, and the concurrent list of the constitution clearly defines the higher position of the conflict if a conflict arises between state and center and state laws. We have cooperative federalism in the country with huge powers given to the center, which gives it an ample power over the state. And ma'am, you have cited the example NDMA Act 2005, which gives the center an edge over the states. And ma'am, the last point I would like to mention that the disaster management should have taken bottom-up approach instead of top-down approach, which is very, very important in this regard, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. And I would like to formally, on behalf of the Political Science Department, I would like to thank Professor Amita Singh and Professor Badrul Alam for taking time out for from your respective schedules and presenting such a comprehensive discourse on this topic. Ma'am, sir, we would love to have you back again in our college once the college reopens. I would also like to thank our principal, Professor Harpreet Kaur, for her unwavering support and encouragement in all our endeavors. A special thanks to Dr. Manisha Mathur, coordinator IQAC, and her entire team, Sangeeta, Ishpreet, and Priyanka, for their unflinching support and coordination in smooth conduct of this webinar. I cannot go without thanking my department. Each of you, thank you so much. And your encouragement and your support is actually very, very important. And thanks to Maitri, our co-convener, and all my friends, Neetu, Paro, and everyone. Thank you so much. And also, thank you all to the participants who have patiently listening to our esteemed speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, once again. Thank you so much, sir. And
thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. We would love to have you.
Yeah, we hope to see you soon in our college.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we
Okay,
can close the meeting. Moitri,
Yes.
shall we close the meeting?
Yes, we can do.
All right.
See you soon, sir.
All right.
Okay, take care, ma'am. Take care, sir.
So much. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
You.
Thank you.